Hi, everybody. This is Travis Fritz from Old Nation Brewing Company. I am here to talk to you today about Whirled, which is our new fruited tart beer, which should hit shelves end of March, early April for everybody out there. What Whirled is a beer that has been tartaned with the addition of acids, organic acids, in order to make a really refreshing beer where the level of tartness and the nature of the tartness really matches with the fruit that we're putting in the beer, right? So we're not talking about smoothie beers here. We're talking about really, really finely tuned fruit and acid that makes for about as good an addition as possible and about as refreshing a beer as we can make here. That is Whirled in a nutshell. We're starting with passion fruit orange guava flavor in the spring. We'll move into strawberry rhubarb a little bit later in the sort of summer, and then into orange cranberry in the winter. And we'll have a few other flavor combinations and fruit combinations that we're working on that you may be able to taste throughout the year at local bars or smaller retail shops, just to kind of test the water, because we're really excited about this beer. I'm going to talk a little bit about sour beers generally and sort of the progress that we followed and the historical progress of sour beers, and why we ended up making Whirled the way that we did in about 10 seconds. So if this is what you were looking for, thank you so much for joining me. If you're looking to hear a little bit more about sour beers generally and what we did to Whirled, please stick around. And I'm just going to go ahead and start now talking about sour beers generally. So all beers were sour historically until about 150 years ago. That's because yeast, although it was recognized what yeast did in beer, i.e. ferment it and change it from a sugar water that we got from grain into the product that is more or less like what we know now, there were also bacteria that would be sort of ambient in the air, what they call indigenous microflora or microfauna. So that means small bacteria or small sort of yeast, just bacteria and yeast, that is indigenous to the area. So it's already there. That was unavoidable. And why beer was, it was so important that beer was fresh and sold locally, back really before the mid 1800s, but maybe a little before that. All the way until, 5 or 10,000 years ago. So short way to say this is all beer used to be sour. Once yeast was isolated in the late 1800s, we became able to make beer that was specific to the flavor of grain, hops, and water, and yeast, I suppose, and didn't have any of this sourness. And because brewers loved that kind of beer was so easy to reproduce and store over long periods of time, and because folks who purchased the beer were so excited that they always knew what they were going to get, and there was a lot less variance, this became the primary way of brewing because it's more able to be industrialized. I think most folks who are into craft beer understand that now Belgium is the country that's most noted for their sour beers. The reason why that is because Belgium, it was not really a cultural backwater or anything, but it was really rural. And it was also split between two countries, so Holland and France. And so what that made was just kind of a place where industrial brewing didn't really happen as much at the same time as it did in, say, Germany, or even here in the United States or England. And they were able to keep those older traditions. A lot of that was because of the monastic breweries that people are familiar with now in Belgium. So breweries that were run by monks. They did it the old way because that's the way monks do stuff. And so what that gives us are these really complex, sometimes really sour beers, but the sourness, because it's coming from different bacteria and yeast, depending on where the brewery is located, identifies that beer based on something like terroir and wine, and also adds these kind of more complex layers in the beer that a lot of folks really like to explore. But of course, some folks don't, because some of these flavors, like in Brettanomyces, which is really relatively popular, wild yeast, what they call wild yeast, will give flavors of like horse blanket, which I like, but takes a while to get used to. A lot of people don't take the time. So that's the traditional way of making beer. Essentially, the brewer brews the beer. It is inoculated ambiently by whatever is in the air or in the area. and then it is fermented. And it's really the brewer's job. Brewing in these sort of breweries, sour beer breweries, is a lot less about brewing the beer and a lot more about blending the beer for consistency. So it's a ton of work for the brewer, and depending on the ability of the brewer, can be a little bit scattershot. And so that's one way. The other way that people do commonly now in American craft beer, particularly to sour beer, was what's called kettle souring. So instead of allowing the bacteria to kind of softly inoculate the wort, which is the sugar water that we get from the grain, and then sort of at its own pace ferment this out into different acids, which it will do, which carry different flavors, that process is sped up. And what happens is generally we'll take the wort, which is a large mass of sugary liquid that we've gotten from soaking and then rinsing these grains in the kettle, which is where we boil that stuff, and raising that temperature to about 100 to 110 degrees, inoculating with bacteria, most commonly lactobacillus strains, different lactobacillus strains, commonly what you might find in yogurt quite often. Will at that 100, 110 degrees move very quickly to sour the beer. So the pH, which is what we depend on, the lower the pH, the more sour the food product or anything, will drop that pH to its full extent, maybe overnight or in a day. So instead of taking weeks or months for that process of souring to happen, it happens in a day. And that's fine. But because it goes so quickly, there's not a lot of nuance, right? So a lot of the nuance that you're getting from things that aren't these lactobacillus bacteria or that aren't commercially available wild yeasts are lost in that process. And additionally, we have to boil that wort that's been soured, right? And we have a lot of bacteria in that wort, which means we have a lot of what's called biomass or wild yeast in that, or yeast in that wort, which makes what we call biomass. It's a bunch of biological stuff that's in there. So when we boil it, just like when you bake bread, in the case of bread, that yeast will bake along with the flour and water. And in the case of kettle sours, that yeast and these healthy, good bacteria will also boil and cook. And so the flavor of that cooked biomass, which in bread is a big part of the flavor of bread, will exist. And sadly, that also exists in kettle sours to one degree or another. There are a lot of people that do really good kettle sours. We've done them. We're proud of the ones that we've done, but it's not our favorite way to drink these sour beers, right? Because there's this added kind of meatiness to the beer. It's an umami flavor that comes from this cooked biomass. It's not bad, but it's not as pure as the kind of sourness that we get from a longer, less controlled inoculation of the product over time. So what's the answer? For us, after having gone through about a year of different ways to blend kettle souring and regular souring, or speed up souring regularly, or whatever, we went through any number of different experiments, we came to adding endogenous acids. So the acids that these bacteria and yeast would make in the process of fermenting a beer over time are commercially available for other food products. And so we look to these acids then to inject into a finished golden ale, which is very neutral ale. And what that allows us to do is to dial the acidity, so the tartness of these beers, specifically into the fruits that we use. So as I said before, passion fruit, orange, guava is the first one that we come out with. We're able to use a cocktail of different acids, naturally occurring acids, in order to build up an acidic base that supports those fruits particularly. And there's a separate base then for strawberry rhubarb, a separate base for orange cranberry, and a separate base for cherry, frankly. We've gone through a number of different fruits. So this allows us then to make the brightest, most refreshing product we possibly can on an absolutely consistent basis for folks that are interested in a tart, refreshing, fruited golden ale that hasn't gone through a great deal of processing in order to be what it is. This makes it extraordinarily consistent, which is really our goal in everything that we make. So it's a great beer. It's been loved by everybody who's tried it. They love the lightness of the beer. They love the refreshing kind of aspect of the beer. We love that too. And we hope that you also do. And we hope that we see all of you out for a beer, hopefully a Whirled sometime soon. Thanks so much for sticking with me for all these 10 minutes. Bye-bye.